Forget New Year, New You. This season is about slowing down, locking the doors, and cozying up at home with the one you really want to do nothing with. Your dog. After the holiday chaos, those quiet nights with a blanket, a podcast, and your pup feel like the reset you actually need. Ollie helps make those moments easier with fresh protein-packed meals made from real human-grade ingredients, so your dog can enjoy some quality comfort food too. Choose from 5 recipes and get a personalized plan for your dog's needs. Meals arrive perfectly proportioned with a scoop and storage container, so serving is fast and mess-free. And with Ollie's in-app on-demand health screenings, supporting your dog is easy, ensuring more cuddles for many years to come. Visit ollie.com/truecrime and use code TRUECRIME for 60% off your first box.
Today's case involves sexual assaults and violence. Listener discretion is advised. 88-year-old Whitney Gunn was a widow who lived by herself at 219 Live Oak Street in downtown New Smyrna Beach, a small beach city located 20 miles south of Daytona Beach. New Smyrna is a popular destination for people who live an hour or more from the ocean. It's often referred to as Orlando's Beach because of the high volume of Orlando area visitors it gets. Whitney grew up in DeLand, an Orlando suburb, but lived most of her life in New Smyrna. Her late husband, Walter, served as New Smyrna's city manager during the 1960s. The couple had run a hardware store in town during the 1940s and 50s. They raised their daughter in New Smyrna and created a life there. Whitney remained there after her husband died. Her daughter, grandchildren, and extended family, meanwhile, lived in or around Winter Haven, an Orlando suburb located about 2 hours northwest of New Smyrna Beach. Beachside New Smyrna, particularly the bars and restaurants along Flagler Avenue, is regularly packed with people at night, but most of the other areas of the city are relatively quiet. The city's population at the time was about 17,000. Whitney's home was located west of the Indian River, a far enough distance from the noisier, more crowded beachside. Any suspicious noise is amplified in the peaceful neighborhood where Whitney lived. When she heard the sounds of someone stumbling around inside her home on the night of July 25, 1990, she got out of bed to investigate. That's when she came upon a male stranger standing in the dark near her staircase. Whitney often used a cane to get around. There was no indication she grabbed it after she got out of bed. She walked outside her bedroom and headed down the hallway. When she stood face to face with the intruder, she didn't turn around or try to get away. She stood her ground. Whitney would later recall to police what the strange man in her house told her. He said, "I'm sorry, I must be in the wrong house." Whitney said the intruder continued talking, but she couldn't understand what else he was saying because it sounded like he was mumbling. She demanded that he get out of her house and told him she was calling the police. That's when he attacked her. Whitney's daughter would later tell the media that her mother wished she had not been so confrontational with the intruder. It appeared to have set him off. Whitney fought back as best as she could, but the stronger, larger male easily overpowered her and forced her into the bedroom. The intruder savagely beat her. He broke her jaw and left cuts and bruises all over her face, neck, arms, and legs, according to police. The intruder also raped her. After he escaped through the back door, Whitney was able to get to the closest phone inside her house and called 911. She told the dispatcher that she believed the intruder was gone, but that there was blood all over. "Do you need to have rescue come see you?" the dispatcher asked. "I think so," Whitney responded. Because it was so dark inside her house, Whitney was unable to give any detailed description of who had attacked her. New Smyrna Beach police and paramedics responded to the house on Live Oak and one of the officers noticed a broken pane of glass in the rear door window. He walked back to the front door and knocked on it. Whitney answered the door, and the police officer was shocked when he saw her face. She was bleeding heavily and was barely able to speak. Whitney died of the injuries she suffered during the attack 2 days later. Investigators were puzzled about what had happened to her. They didn't know the intent of the intruder. Nothing inside the house appeared to have been stolen. Whitney couldn't give a description of her assailant, but she felt certain she had never met him before. New Smyrna's police chief at the time, Denver Fleming, told the Orlando Sentinel days after the slaying that Whitney's murder was a tremendous, horrible crime, and that the investigation was his agency's top priority. The chief went on to say that his investigators were working longer shifts every day following leads and canvassing downtown area neighborhoods. They interviewed as many people as they could. In October 1991, 15 months after the crime, the Orlando Sentinel published a story about how a string of unsolved killings in southeast Volusia County had fueled anxiety among residents. The case that was the centerpiece for the story was the Whitney Gunn murder. In that story, Whitney's daughter, Libby King, told the Sentinel that she hated the thought of a fiendish rapist who had killed her mother, still walking the streets. In that same article, Libby described to the reporter the horror of seeing her mother with a broken and swollen face, and seeing her arms and legs covered in bruises. She said, "There's nothing more degrading and horrible to happen to anyone, and I won't rest until he's caught." Denver Fleming told the media that detectives had several suspects, but he declined to disclose them. In reality, the actual culprit was currently in jail for another crime, one he had committed 4 months before the Sentinel article was published. Today's episode takes a look at a very determined investigation and focuses on the importance of justice in these cases we cover, the importance of getting a conviction for a victim's family, no matter how many years have gone by, and no matter if the killer is already in prison for something else. This is Jillian, and in partnership with Law and Crime, you are listening to Court Junkie, episode 177. On June 17, 1991, less than 11 months after Whitney Gunn's murder, there was another attack in the area. The victim in this case was a 45-year-old woman whose car had been sideswiped along Interstate 4, about 30 miles northeast of Orlando. The victim was startled and shaken by the collision. She pulled to the side of the road, as did the young male driver who had struck her car. The woman had the presence of mind to jot down the license plate number of the vehicle that struck hers. She wrote it down on a scrap of paper. Moments later, the driver who rammed the woman's car approached her. He introduced himself using a fake name. The woman had her window rolled down when he approached her. Without warning, the man reached inside, pulled the woman's hair, and forced her out of her car. He moved her out of the view of the roadway and dragged her to a wooded area. That's where he beat her and assaulted her. The woman lay naked on the ground and played dead. Her assailant, thinking he was leaving her to die, ran back to his car and sped away. The severely injured woman stumbled back to her car, still naked, and drove home. Once she got home, she called law enforcement. A Volusia County Sheriff's deputy responded to the area of the crime and found some property that belonged to the victim. He then found a piece of paper lying on the ground. It had a license plate number scribbled on it. It was a vital clue. The tag number was traced to Harry Young, a resident of Edgewater, about 30 miles south of Daytona Beach and directly south of New Smyrna Beach. Harry Young was interviewed by authorities. He told them that his teenage son had used his car all day. His son's name was Lynn Young. Detectives inspected Harry's car. It had fresh damage, and the license plate had been removed. Lynn Young was interviewed and photographed. The victim was shown the photograph, and she positively identified him as her attacker. 10 days after the incident, on June 27, 1991, Lynn Young was arrested on charges of aggravated assault and sexual battery. He was sentenced to 10 years in prison, but served less than 4 years before being released. Records show he was released on March 1, 1996, for good behavior. On January 9, 1997, 10 months after the now 24-year-old Lynn Young's release from prison, another woman was attacked. This victim was 65 years old. The crime occurred in Edgewater. During the night of January 8th, Lynn was at a bar called Chaps. He was there drinking with his then-girlfriend, who was 20 years older than him, and a group of friends. The group was comprised of about a dozen people. Lynn told his girlfriend and his friends that he had to get up early the next morning for work. He left around 11:30 p.m. One report stated that Lynn left the bar angrily after he had spent the evening arguing with his girlfriend. Less than 40 minutes later, the Volusia County Sheriff's Office received a 911 call about a home invasion rape. The victim said she was lying in bed in her mobile home watching television and reading a travel pamphlet when she heard a suspicious noise coming from outside. Moments later, she heard a knock at her door. She heard a male voice on the other side of the door. He claimed he was a police officer and he needed to use her phone. He then ordered the woman to open the door. The woman looked through the peephole, but the man covered it with his hand. The woman opened the door, but intended to just crack it and peek through. That's when the man pushed hard against the door and moved his foot forward to prevent her from closing it. He forced his way inside and told the woman another lie. He said he needed to use her phone because he was in trouble and needed to get to Georgia. The frightened woman was suspicious that the man in her house was there to rob her. She told him where her phone was and then grabbed her purse, carried it into her bedroom, and threw it on the bed. She came out of the bedroom, and that's when the man confronted her. He pushed the woman back into her bedroom. He removed his clothes and removed hers. He then raped her. After he was done, he took his shirt and wiped down everything he had touched inside the house. He also washed his hands in the bathroom. As he left, he told her, "I know what you're going to do, and my name is Derek, son of Robin." Then he walked out and fled in an unknown direction. When the victim called 911, she was able to provide a vivid description of her attacker. She described him as a white man who stood about 5 feet 10 inches tall, with dark hair and a mustache. He weighed about 200 pounds and had a tattoo on his right arm. A composite sketch was drawn up, and it was shown around town. One deputy took the drawing to Chaps, the bar that Lynn had visited, and some people at the bar positively identified the man as someone they knew. It was a spitting image of Lynn. A canine was dispatched to the scene, and the dog tracked a scent from the victim's home to another house on a neighboring street. The house was on Coleman Street in Edgewater. It was Lynn's parents' house. He didn't live there, but he would often stay there. Lynn's girlfriend was interviewed, and she described what happened the night of the home invasion. She told detectives that Lynn left Chaps before she did and was gone for about an hour before she picked him up at someone else's house in the neighborhood and brought him back to her place. She admitted she didn't know Lynn's whereabouts during that hour. Police tracked down Lynn and interviewed him. He denied raping the victim, but agreed to be photographed. He had shaved his mustache, but police realized immediately that he had been sporting one because the skin above his upper lip wasn't as tanned as other areas of his face. Lynn's girlfriend also said that Lynn had shaved his face the morning after she picked him up. The victim wasn't fooled by the shaved mustache either. She was shown a photo of Lynn and positively identified him as her attacker. It took less than 48 hours for police to arrest Lynn for the crime. He was charged with aggravated sexual battery, abuse of the elderly, burglary, and impersonating a police officer. In October 1998, Lynn was tried for the Edgewater rape. The jury returned quickly with a guilty verdict. The victim spoke to the judge during the sentencing hearing. She told the judge that she and her neighbors continued to live in fear, even after Lynn's arrest. She said there was no getting over a crime like that, even knowing that her rapist would never spend another day outside prison. He has just turned our lives upside down, she told the judge. Lynn's parents also spoke during the hearing. They pleaded with the judge to spare their son. Lynn's father, Harry Young, described something that had happened to Lynn when he was 15 years old. He had been severely injured and had incurred brain damage after climbing onto a transformer. Harry said, "Instead of just locking him up in a cage and forgetting about him, is it possible to try and find a measure of empathy and help him?" While his father testified, Lynn wiped away tears. The judge listened but was unswayed. He ultimately sentenced Lynn Young to life in prison, plus 62 years. After the hearing, the prosecutor came away satisfied. Lynn's defense attorney came away appalled at the harsh sentence. He called the life sentence and the additional 62 years totally unnecessary. It would take another 20 years before Lynn Young's name would elicit headlines again. Growing up in New Smyrna Beach, Lynn Young made one wrong choice after another, according to those who knew him. While a teenager, he ran with shady people and had a penchant for lying. At the age of 15, Lynn was severely injured after climbing on top of a transformer at a local school. He told people he climbed on it to retrieve a racquetball. Whatever the reason, Lynn was severely shocked and hospitalized. The voltage was so strong that Lynn nearly died. He reportedly suffered permanent brain damage. Lynn committed his first known sex crime when he was 16. In 1989, he sodomized a teenage girl, according to police. The record of that crime has been purged. Lynn's next couple of crimes occurred the following year. In June 1990, he was arrested and charged with burglary, aggravated assault, and aggravated battery. The victim, an adult male, was struck with a baseball bat. He was beaten and kicked by Lynn and his 19-year-old accomplice. Lynn received very little jail time for that attack, and his criminal life was about to intensify. During the summer of 1990, Lynn stayed with his grandmother at a house at 112 South Myrtle Avenue, about a half mile from the home of Whitney Gunn. During Lynn Young's second stint in prison, the Whitney Gunn case kept getting colder. There were times when evidence was sent to a lab and hopes were raised, but nothing stuck. People originally associated with the case retired, moved away, or in some cases, passed away. Ryan Will was a longtime felony prosecutor in the 7th Judicial Circuit, which includes Volusia County.
When you look at the case in a kind of a macro sense, what you have is a horrific crime, a very loving, kind, generous woman, by all accounts, who was killed in this just awful sense. And really no recognizable lead, because every single time that the case starts to develop in a direction, the individual handling either the case or the interview or the facts, if it's a witness, that individual dies. And so it's just this series of kind of, starts and stops, where the case and its progress is being frustrated because of time.
In January 2012, a reserve investigator was called in to take a look at the stack of New Smyrna Beach police cold cases. His name was David Donaway, who was a retired investigator with the Florida Department of Law Enforcement. Joining him was Bill Bennett, the former police chief in neighboring Edgewater. The two of them, along with New Smyrna Beach Police homicide detective Nikki Diffin, were determined to break one or more of the cases that had long stumped local authorities. At or near the top of the list was the murder of Whitney Gunn. Donaway, in particular, was struck by how unusual the Gunn case was. This was a random burglary of an elderly woman's home, during which the victim was raped and beaten to death, and nothing had been stolen from inside the house. Such cases of elderly women being sexually battered were extremely rare. Rachel Lovell is an assistant professor of criminology at Cleveland State University. Throughout her career, her research has centered on gender-based violence and victimization, particularly when it comes to sexual assault cases.
Elderly individuals being sexually assaulted is certainly not common, but it's not. There's definitely a victimology there. So in that, in our data, for example, you can see that there are older women, elderly women who have been sexually assaulted, and some of the reemerging themes and patterns that you can see in that does have to do with victimization and access and vulnerabilities.
According to Lovell, sex offenders and predators often do have a type, but their biggest motivation for committing such a crime is that the victim is isolated and or defenseless.
I think, in other words, people put too much weight on the actual victim characteristics as compared to victim situational factors. And those and different types of vulnerabilities, which help them carry out their assaults in much higher rates than perhaps so they're not, in other words, they're not just looking for a certain type, someone who's blonde, someone who has black hair, someone who's this height, someone who's this weight, someone who's this race, but is more interested in completing the sexual assault and the act of the sexual assault and the perpetration of sexual assault.
While looking through the Whitney Gunn file, David Donaway reviewed the contents closely. He discovered that in January 2000, a previous investigator had gone to the Volusia County Jail to speak to one of Whitney Gunn's neighbors. The neighbor's name was Scott Rongstad, a 37-year-old with a long criminal record. Rongstad, who was 27 at the time of the crime, and who had been questioned by police shortly after the murder, was adamant during his jail interview with the investigator that he had nothing to do with the murder. He agreed to provide a DNA sample, which never matched with any of the DNA recovered at the crime scene or on Whitney's clothing. Rongstad told the investigator that he had been inside his apartment on Douglas Avenue with his girlfriend at the time. His apartment was within sight of Whitney's home. Both he and his girlfriend had seen another man in the area of Whitney's front porch the night she was attacked. He identified that man as Lawrence Leuperger. Leuperger, who, unlike Rongstad, didn't have a criminal history aside from marijuana charges, had lived in another home in the area and had a friend who often stayed with him. The two of them were known to smoke marijuana together. Rongstad referred to that second man as a known rapist. During his first jail interview with the investigator, Rongstad couldn't remember the name of the known rapist who regularly hung out with Leuperger. He called that same investigator a few weeks later and said he finally remembered who that person was, and his name was Lynn Young. The investigator looked up Lynn Young in the state prison database and learned he had been convicted in a sexual battery case out of Edgewater and was serving a life sentence. The detective never followed up on the tip, but did include that detail in the file. Rongstad would later have several more conversations with investigators about the Whitney Gunn case. His level of interest in helping police would fluctuate, but he ultimately helped detectives zero in on the right person. Rongstad died of a terminal illness in 2018. Lawrence Luperger also was questioned. He denied any involvement, and no evidence linked him to the crime, but he provided no useful information to authorities. When investigators tracked him down in Ohio in late 2018 and confronted him about the case, he openly wept in front of them. He vehemently denied he was involved and said to detectives, "Whoever did this shit needs to rot in hell because I had nothing to do with it." Police tried to convince him to submit fingerprints and to cooperate, but each time he refused. Donaway, along with Bill Bennett and Nikki Diffin, decided to double down on the Lynn Young lead. They also discussed amongst themselves what evidence was still available to resubmit to a lab. There wasn't much left. During the years prior, detectives had some awful luck when it came to lab testing. Here's Ryan Will talking about the most critical piece of forensic evidence that remained: the nightgown that Whitney Gunn was wearing when she was attacked.
Over the years, we have this nightgown. The police have it, and they continue to conduct updated testing. Each time science improves, they send it back to the lab, and they learn a little bit more, and they learn a little bit more, and they learn a little bit more.
Detectives had a long history with that nightgown, which they had kept inside an evidence locker since the day Whitney Gunn was brought to the hospital. The time had come as far back as 2005, 15 years after the killing and still several years before Donaway took over the investigation, to send a sample of the nightgown to a lab with the expectation that it would result in a match. That lab was located along Louisiana's Gulf Coast. Hopes for a break in the case got dashed again.
And about that time, Hurricane Katrina comes along and completely destroys the laboratory. Blows it off the face of the earth, as best I can tell. Evidence is scattered and lost.
By the time Donaway and the other investigators reopened the case 7 years later, there was very little left to go on. Only a tiny sample of that nightgown with traces of DNA was still available. In June 2017, Donaway and the other detectives met with a forensic specialist at the Orlando Crime Lab to discuss what could be resubmitted as evidence. Several pieces of evidence were ultimately turned in, most notably a remaining square section remaining from Whitney's nightgown. So many squares had been cut out of the nightgown and submitted to labs during the years that it looked like Swiss cheese, but there was still one cut that appeared to contain the suspect's DNA. Here's prosecutor Andy Urbanek, who took over the case prior to the trial, describing the advances in technology 5 years ago that enabled forensic specialists to link the remaining DNA sample to the suspect.
Come 2015, 2016, the advancements in DNA analysis, and specifically the development of their ability, FDLE's ability to process mixed profiles, was what allowed them to finally identify Mr. Young. And the way they did that is that they were able to, from one of the old cuttings where they still had enough to process, they were able to find a mixed DNA profile. And the mixed DNA profile, whenever they have an item that's from a person that they can know that person's DNA is going to be from. So if they took my shirt and they tested it, they could assume if they found a mixed profile, my DNA would be among the mixed profile, be one of the contributors to the mixed profile. Whitney Gunn's DNA they had, and they're able to look at that mixed profile that they found that had a couple contributors, and they were able to assume that her profile was part of that mixed profile. And then by having Lynn Young's DNA, they could look at the separate mixture, the separate contributor to the profile, and determine that he was the other contributor, and give a calculation of how likely it is that it's him and Whitney Gunn as opposed to him and anybody else. And the likelihood ratio was off the charts that he was the contributor mixed with Whitney Gunn's DNA profile from that stain on her nightgown.
A month or so after the nightgown sample was submitted, the Orlando lab called Donaway and told him of the DNA match to Lynn Young. His semen was found on the garment. In that moment for investigators, they knew they got their man.
I think until we got the scientific return on the nightgown, no one was certain that it was Lynn Young.
By March 2018, investigators were ready to seal the case. It was time for them to confront Lynn Young, who at the time was incarcerated at Hardy Correctional Institution, located about 45 miles south of Lakeland. The interview was voluntary, and Lynn agreed to answer questions. It lasted more than 4 hours. It was recorded and later played in court. In the end, Lynn told investigators that he never knew Whitney Gunn, and he had never entered her house. But those denials worked against him.
In those final days of investigation, the investigators from New Smyrna Beach Police Department went to see Lynn Young in state custody, and they gave him the opportunity to discuss Whitney Gunn and whether he knew her or whether he had any contact with her, whether he'd ever been in that house, whether he knew anything about this nightgown, whether there was any reason at all that his DNA, specifically his semen, could have been on her nightgown. And in that moment, if he had offered a halfway plausible explanation, I'm not sure that we could have defeated that. But thankfully, he did what many criminals do, and he tried to distance himself from it, and he lied. He said he didn't know her, he had never been in her house, he had no reason for his DNA or his biology to be on her or her clothing. And the combination of the two just proved fatal. That was the ultimate downfall for him in that moment when he chose to lie to investigators.
Ryan Will, who was still a prosecutor with the state attorney's office in early 2018, pursued a warrant to get a fresh DNA sample from Young, and a judge signed it. After the DNA was collected and the match was confirmed, a grand jury met in June of that year. Donaway was one of the main witnesses who testified during the hearing. The following day, Lynn Young was visited by Donaway and a sergeant with the New Smyrna Beach Police Department. They told Lynn that he had been indicted for murder. That same day, Chief Mike Coffin went to the home of Libby King, the daughter of Whitney Gunn, who by that time was roughly the same age as her mother when she was killed. Coffin told her that her mother's killer had been identified and indicted for murder. A few days after that, Mike Coffin held a media conference announcing the 28-year-old cold case had been solved.
28 years ago, on July 25th, 1990, 88-year-old Whitney Gunn was asleep in her home at 219 Live Oak here in New Smyrna, and she awoke to some sounds inside her house. She lived alone there, so there shouldn't have been any sounds. She went to investigate and was accosted. She was brutally assaulted and sexually battered. Despite being left for dead inside her home, she was able to call 911, and our officers back then responded. She was taken to the hospital. She was able to provide some information to those officers, but unfortunately she succumbed to her injuries 3 days later on July 28th. An autopsy revealed that her death was due to blunt force trauma and was a homicide. Although officers investigated this crime 28 years ago, they were unsuccessful in solving it. Over the years that followed, different detectives worked on the case on and off, They received some tips, but they just weren't able to piece the case together. One thing remained the same. We would never give up. I am so proud to be associated with professional law enforcement investigators like Nikki Diffin and Dave Dunaway. They were relentless in pursuing the facts and never gave up hope that we would find justice for Whitney Gunn. That's what today is about. This is about Whitney Gunn.
But even though police were certain they had finally solved the case, nearly 30 years had passed. Some witnesses, including a few who worked the investigation in 1990, were deceased. Those still around had foggy memories. Whitney Gunn's family had waited 3 decades for a conviction. Would they get it? From the time of the indictment to the time of the trial, the state had numerous challenges to deal with. There was the COVID-19 pandemic, which resulted in a multitude of disruptions and delays. Ryan Will had left the state attorney's office for a private practice job, so a new prosecutor, Andy Urbanek, had to be assigned to it during the pretrial phase. There were other high hurdles for the prosecution. Those few witnesses from 1990 who were still around were not much help to the case, either because their memories weren't sharp or they were traumatized by what they saw that night, or both. Tony Ford, the original New Smyrna Beach police detective who responded to the scene, had been brought in for a deposition. The now retired investigator had almost no memory of the incident. The same went for Todd Williams, a firefighter EMT who lived next door to Whitney Gunn. He was on duty that night and was among the first emergency responders to arrive at the scene. He remembered hearing his elderly neighbor tell him that she had been raped. She told him that while he helped secure her to the backboard that was used to carry her to the ambulance. During his deposition in 2019, Williams said he was overwhelmed by what had happened that night, next door to where he and his family lived. He added that it was very upsetting reliving those painful memories from 30 years earlier. He had blocked it from his memory and was unable or unwilling to conjure many details. It wasn't long after Urbanek took over the case that he realized how challenging it was going to be for him to attain a conviction against Lynn Young. Whitney Gunn's family didn't want to go through a trial, but there seemed to be no convincing the defendant to confess, even with the DNA match hovering over him. Additionally, Lynn's own erratic behavior was causing disruptions. That came to a head during one major development in the pre-trial phase of the case, in June 2020, when it was announced that Lynn was going to enter a guilty plea and avoid a trial altogether. But once again, things didn't go as planned at that hearing.
We thought we had it worked out. And Mr. Young, up until that point, behavior wasn't too erratic. But he, at the same time, he wasn't your typical inmate at the county jail, didn't have a lot of communication with people, wasn't writing a lot of letters, and indicated to his attorney that he was willing to accept the plea deal. So in the middle of the pandemic, we brought the family down out to the jail, even the 90-year-old daughter of the victim, and were set for a plea. And he walked in that day and kind of changed his mindset quite a bit, to the point where he was almost espousing sovereign citizenship type belief, that he was a corporation and that his corporation couldn't be subject to the prosecution, citing a lot of United States code. And, that day when he was supposed to plea and he started saying these things to our judge, she understood right away that he needed to be evaluated before he took any type of plea or before the case went forward. And that did slow down our case for several months because of the process of getting an evaluation during COVID. We can't get our doctors in. And when they do get in, it's very difficult for them to get in and have access to the inmate.
So the wait continued. Among the family members who attended that hearing in June 2020 were Libby Young, Whitney's daughter, who at the time was 90 years old, and Whitney's great-granddaughter, Whitney Crowder. Here's an emotional Crowder talking to a WESH 2 news reporter outside the courtroom after Lynn Young backed out of entering a guilty plea at the last minute.
I was 11 years old when she was raped and murdered, and it has followed me through my whole life. So I'd like some closure.
Andy Urbanek said Lynn Young's behavior was nothing more than a ploy to prolong the case. After the mental health examinations were completed, and after it was clear to the judge that he was competent to stand trial, jury selection was finally scheduled. The trial began in late March 2021. Brenda Salter, the emergency room doctor who treated Whitney after she was admitted to the local hospital, was among the state's witnesses, but she didn't have any memories of that day in 1990. She was able to confirm, however, that the nightgown submitted into evidence was indeed the nightgown that Whitney was wearing when she was taken to the hospital. That confirmation was critical to the prosecution's case.
She had no memory of this incident. We presented her before trial to prep her, obviously her report, her photographs of the victim in the hospital, and it just did not jog her memory. So she was testifying solely from the contents of her rape crisis report that she completed. And she recognized the writing on the report. That's how we're able to authenticate the report through her. And on the report, it indicated that she did collect a sexual assault kit and also collected a nightgown.
Urbanek pointed out that because the doctor had no memory of the nightgown, he had to do all he could to convince the jury that the nightgown that was submitted into evidence was the very garment the victim was wearing the night she was attacked. The doctor's notes were included in the court record. There were hospital photographs to support her testimony, as well as testimony from the victim's grandson, who confirmed on the stand that he saw his grandmother wearing the nightgown when he visited her in the hospital. He was the first family member to see Whitney after she was admitted. Additionally, the victim's DNA was on the nightgown. In spite of everything, the state had to authenticate the nightgown, and Urbanek wasn't sure he had enough.
But until that nightgown was in evidence, until the sexual assault kit was in evidence, I was certainly on edge throughout the trial. I thought that was going to be our biggest challenge, to make sure we presented enough to get it in, because if we didn't, the case would be significantly compromised.
So everything hinged on that nightgown. Much to Urbanek's surprise, the defense never challenged the authenticity of it.
They did not attack the nightgown at all, or attack the authenticity, or even object when we introduced the nightgown. And I was surprised. And the defense did a good job in this case. They worked with what they had in the case, but didn't challenge me on the old evidence.
The COVID-19 pandemic has altered how trials and hearings are conducted in courtrooms across the country. And Volusia County, in spite of being located in a state with fewer pandemic-related restrictions, is no exception. Due to social distancing regulations, spectators were spaced out more, and court officials and defendants were seated differently. That meant that Whitney's family got a good look at the man accused of killing her. Too good of a look.
Typically, the victim's family would be behind the defendant, and he wouldn't have the opportunity to be making eye contact or watching the victim's family throughout the trial. But because our courtroom was switched around for COVID purposes, he would be facing, or he was facing, the back door. And to have, I think that was a unique thing in all of these COVID cases, since we've had trials again, is that the defendants faced the victim throughout the trial. And that was a unique experience to know and to talk to the family and know that they're basically having eye contact with him throughout the trial and seeing how he reacted to certain pieces of evidence.
After several days of witness testimony, motions, and arguments, the case finally went to the jury.
And the jury stayed back there for a while. They then came forward and indicated after a couple questions that they were deadlocked. They potentially wanted to hear Mr. Young's interview again as well. And the judge instructed them that we would have to work on getting the portion of the interview they wanted to hear and that they would need to go back and keep deliberating.
The deadlocked jury and the request to review the recorded interview were ominous signs that a conviction was far from certain. Then came another development, one that the prosecution had no preparation for.
Well, shortly after that, one of the jurors actually developed high blood pressure and had to be taken to the emergency room, which is something I've never happened in my career, where a juror has to be rushed to the emergency room and we've already excused our alternates. So a decision had to be made whether or not we would proceed with 11 jurors. And the only way you can proceed with fewer than the required amount is if the parties agree.
The prosecution and the defense did ultimately agree to proceed. Urbanek consulted with Whitney's family, who assured him they wanted to see it through, even if the possibility was a hung jury, or worse, an acquittal. They had come so far that it made no sense to request a mistrial, no matter the uncertain outlook. By the time everyone agreed to go forward, something else happened. Lin Young decided he wanted to enter a guilty plea. He agreed to admit to the killing in exchange for a 25-year sentence, 10 years fewer than the original plea agreement that he had backed out of months earlier. The amount of years wasn't important to Whitney's family because Lin Young was already serving a life sentence. What they wanted above all was a public admission. They were about to finally get it.
And in fact, the family indicated to me they'd actually were going to feel better with a plea than a guilty verdict from a jury. Because they felt like if a jury found him guilty, that's just somebody else saying he did it, as opposed to if he says guilty, he's admitting it, he's acknowledging it, he's coming clean and saying, yes, I did this.
Urbanek said he wasn't convinced Lin would enter his plea until he actually did so. This time, he kept his end of the bargain and entered a guilty plea. When it was finally over, the family came away relieved, and everyone involved in the case, from the cold case investigators to the state attorney's office, came away feeling rewarded.
But when you compare that to a 1990 cold case, the oldest cold case I've ever prosecuted and probably ever will, and such an innocent victim, a victim who, by all accounts of the family, was a really functional 89, 90-year-old woman. I mean, a woman who still lived by herself, still walked to the store a couple times a week, according to her neighbors. She didn't even have family that close. She had family about 30 minutes away or an hour away. And to have her become a victim to this type of crime, have the family go through that experience, and then have the family wait for 25, almost 30 years before there is a suspect identified, and then a couple more years till that suspect pleads guilty at his jury trial. That's the part I'll remember. And I don't think I can't see myself ever being as close to a family as I was to this one. I enjoyed their company. They were good people, and they deserved the outcome they got. If the guilty plea is what they wanted, they got what gave them the most closure. And I know they celebrated and they were very happy with the conviction because, again, it's something that they never thought they would see happen.
Ryan Will, the initial prosecutor on the case, also bonded with the family. After his life as a prosecutor ended, the Whitney Gunn murder case was one of the few cases that stuck with him the most, in large part because of the relationship he had with the family. He was there when Libby King and her children and grandchildren learned of Lin Young's arrest. He knew firsthand how much that development meant to them.
We all know the problems with cold cases. There's a reason they go cold. And very, very infrequently are they ever given life again. Are they ever picked back up and successful? Because time is your worst enemy in criminal investigation and prosecution. And so when this piece of forensic evidence comes along and gives life to the case again, and I think it gave tremendous relief to a family who had mourned a loved one for many, many years.
Urbanek said the family was not only relieved at the outcome of the case, but relieved they no longer had that lingering question unanswered. The same question that many loved ones of victims of cold cases constantly ask. Why did this happen?
The questions must have just killed the family. And when you found out that it was Lin Young, that he was the perpetrator, I think that answered or helped answer some of those why questions, because you could look at his history throughout his life, from the time he was a teenager to the time in 1997 when he was convicted of sexual battery and burglary of another elderly woman. You understood that, okay, this is a person who has significant issues and just a horrible human being who has proclivities that most people don't have. I mean, he is a unique individual in that regard, not in a good way. But that answers some of the questions. Okay, the why can be because this guy was a sick human being, and this was the kind of thing he was into throughout his life, demonstrated by his criminal history.
Urbanek said Lin Young's criminal history was based on finding victims he knew he could overpower. He also wanted the assurance that he could commit the crime without interruption. That was his MO when he killed Whitney Gunn, as well as when he attacked the motorist on Interstate 4 and invaded the home of the elderly woman in Edgewater.
I think he was an opportunist, and anytime he had an opportunity to commit a sexual battery and had an easy target, he would take advantage of it. And I think that it's just another instance of him trying to take advantage of somebody that he thought was an easy target.
Criminologist Rachel Lovell said when criminals, particularly sexual predators, commit one crime against a victim and are successful, there is the likelihood that the criminal will attack someone with a similar profile again and under similar circumstances. In Lin Young's case, he targeted older women who lived alone.
I think really, if you're looking at this, being able to really see that it has a lot to do with who is most vulnerable and whose vulnerabilities can be exploited in order to complete the act. And so here, someone who's elderly, maybe unable to be able to fight or resist in the same sort of way, helps ensure. And then if you have a preference for that, offenders do learn over time, which, as they continue to offend, sometimes they do learn from prior acts. And so they may, they would they would rape many different types of people. But here they sort of tend to go down one path because that's sort of the path where it has been successful for them in the past.
In the end, Lin Young got caught and was convicted for all of the known crimes he committed against his victims. He is serving his life sentence at the Century Correctional Institution outside Pensacola. He is not eligible for parole. There are some disturbing national trends with regards to murder clearance rates. In 2017, roughly 62% of homicides and only 35% of sexual assaults per year were solved, according to the FBI Uniform Crime Report. Those numbers are worsening as murder rates are increasing, authorities have said. Meanwhile, as cold cases are stacking up nationwide, so few of them are getting solved, even with advances in technology. According to FBI data, there are about 250,000 unsolved murders across the United States. On average, an additional 6,000 cold cases are added every year. And that's all for this episode. As always, I'd love to hear your thoughts about this case. Let me know by joining the conversation on Instagram @CourtJunkie, by tweeting me @CourtJunkiePod, or by emailing me at podcast@CourtJunkie.com. This episode was researched and written by Tony Holt. And a special thank you to Ryan Will, Andy Urbanek, and Rachel Lovell for talking to us about this case. If you'd like to hear these episodes without the ads and hear additional Court Junkie bonus episodes, check out my Patreon options at CourtJunkie.com/support. And be sure to subscribe to my YouTube channel at youtube.com/courtjunkie. Thanks again for listening. Until next time.